The buyer was surprised by how much due diligence was going to be required by my seller.
In my experience, when sellers see the entire due diligence list from a buyer, there's rows and rows of requirements, and many of those are hidden. Sometimes it's 346 line items. The sellers have a heartbeat that has been missed. So at what point did your buyer say, gulp, I'm about to go through all of this?
My buyer was very shocked when he saw the list of requirements that the seller had, thinking that bringing the right price that was negotiated in the LOI would be sufficient enough to get the transaction through the process.
Right. Most buyers don't feel like they have to work their way into getting themselves ingratiated by the seller. And then what did you do? Welcome back to another episode of IAG's War Room. In the trenches, M&A stories where M&A experts talk about how they fought real-world battles of selling businesses, how they ultimately won and closed the deal, or as we like to say, we won the war. I'm Joe Lieberman, Senior Managing Director of IAG. Our guest today is Kent Gaudian, Managing Director of IAG. Today's segment is called The Cleaner, where our guest had to clean up a mess before it actually sold. And it's a good one. So let's go to war. Kent, let's talk about your career and how you got into M&A.
Started my career in banking, had the opportunity to follow my father's footsteps, who was a bank CEO in rural Iowa. And that just grew into opportunities through merger acquisitions, and one transition to another. I retired early, so my wife and I could live much, much closer from our grandchildren.
And how did you find us at IAG?
Actually, I put it out on LinkedIn, and IAG said, would you apply and let's have a discussion.
We hunted you down. All right. So today's segment is called The Cleaner. And as I understand it, you had to clean up a little bit of a mess to get the deal done, so to speak. Why don't you set it up for us?
I had a potential buyer for my very first client who was a really, really small cleaning company. And that didn't pan out. My prospective buyer said, hey, would you be interested in selling our business? What was really interesting is that they had a very high concentration. About 90% of their revenue was from two clients, really large commercial relationships. I knew that was going to be a challenge. People don't want to look at an acquisition where you have just two clients that make up most of that revenue. But these clients had been 30-year clients, and it just kept growing and growing as they added branches, a really nice revenue stream that kept growing. So that was the first challenge.
Did he have contracts with those clients?
Did have contracts with those clients. Mm-hmm. He had these renewable contracts with them that he had the opportunity to increase both on pricing and bringing on new branches. So it was really an interesting mix. So while it's a negative, it's also a positive because you have this consistent growing revenue.
Customer concentration is a good problem that can be solved over time. You certainly don't want to cut your client revenue. You just want to grow into it and make them ultimately a smaller percentage of your revenue.
Correct. So in the underwriting with the SBA, it was a challenge to make sure that the concentration wouldn't stop it getting underwritten. So when we first started off, my seller wanted to make sure that he was finding the absolute right buyer to take care of the customers that he had built these long-term relationships with. As we found one that was a perfect fit, lived very close in that market, looking to expand and take on a different line of business. And as we started to work through the due diligence for the buyer, all of a sudden I found out my seller had this huge due diligence list that he wanted to get from the buyer, which is not a normal process that we go through.
Yeah.
We do some due diligence to make sure that they're legitimate buyers. But this gentleman that was my seller wanted 10 plus years of tax returns. He had this verification list that was longer than the buyer's list.
Wanted a family tree history.
He did. He did. He wanted the family tree. So as we went through this whole process, I really just had a discussion and said, we need to get a meeting in between the two of you so you can build some confidence that they can deliver. The challenge was getting the seller comfortable with the buyer, that they could deliver on the services for his clients that he had been taking care of for these 30 plus years.
Was that alarming? If I'm in a situation where the seller has all of these requirements, it is sometimes a red flag about how difficult it will be to making sure the buyer and the seller are the right fit.
It was a little bit of a concern. I had worked with this individual for another one of the clients, and so I knew their approach. And my 39 years of bank customer service, working through with clients, I just found a way to build a comfort level and said that I would help take care of that process for him. So really the due diligence process got to be a lot easier over time, and we built a really, really good relationship.
How did you prepare a buyer for what they were about to go through?
So we had lots of interest. In fact, there was so much interest initially, and finding that right fit was a really, really big challenge. He wanted to make sure that it was an individual buyer, that it that skill set. I believe there was a total of 30 plus buyers. There might have been as many as 50 NDAs signed.
So you go through the normal process of generating interest and ultimately getting something in writing, an LOI. You've prepared the buyer that there's going to be some due diligence coming from the opposite direction. And I'm assuming that you were able to overcome that shock.
Correct. It was a discussion that wasn't easy at first. The buyer was surprised by how much due diligence was going to be required by my seller.
You have a buyer that has made the right offer. You prepared them for the concept of due diligence from your seller, and you unveil the list. He's pretty surprised. I know in my experience, when sellers see the entire due diligence list from a buyer, there's rows and rows of requirements, and many of those are hidden. Sometimes it's 346 line items. The sellers have a heartbeat that has been missed. So at what point did your buyer say, gulp, I'm about to go through all of this?
My buyer was very shocked when he saw the list of requirements that the seller had, thinking that bringing the right price that was negotiated in the LOI would be sufficient enough to get the transaction through the process.
Right. Most buyers don't feel like they have to work their way into getting themselves ingratiated by the seller. So you've got this set up where it's going to happen both ways. And then what did you do?
So with the customer concentration, my first challenge was to get the process SBA approved. That was a process that I could lean back on my career. I had the opportunity to work with a national SBA lender and walk them through the process. 30-year relationship, clients, all of those helped the comfort level increase with the SBA lender. And then I got a formal commitment letter for the purchase. And so I could use that then with the buyer and help them get approval and build their comfort level also with this huge customer concentration.
Sure. When a buyer knows that it's been pre-qualified, they have not only high degree of confidence that it can be funded, but this idea that a financial institute has vetted it in advance helps bolster the price that you're asking for.
Yes, getting the pre-approval helped build the confidence from the buyer's perspective, knowing that concentration wasn't going to stop it from getting funded.
Great. So then you had this situation where both parties are doing diligence on each other. And as we talked about, it's a surprise from the buyer's perspective that they're going to have to unveil their history, their family tree. How did you overcome that?
I was starting to get some pushback from the buyer saying, I didn't know to go this kind of process to get this transaction done. My thought was just getting them in the same room. They could see each other, meet each other, have a discussion, get the two wives and the two gentlemen to sit down and just have a conversation. And that conversation went extremely well. My seller had great confidence in the buyer's ability to deliver the service, but also the spouse's ability to interact with the two client commercial relationships. So that was the piece that really helped push this over the top. getting some comfort level that what was being expected could be delivered by both parties.
Was it a situation where the buyer really understood at some point why the seller was caretaking on behalf of his clients, that this was not just a anal A-type seller, that he really did care about the transition, the legacy of his business?
During this meeting, it became very evident to the buyer why the seller had so much concern. He had had these relationships for 30 plus years. He knew those people. He knew their families. He knew their kids. He knew their grandkids. And so they built a really long relationship. My buyer at that point also understood why there was so much concern about getting the right group of people in here to service these clients.
I imagine that was a pretty quick resolution, right?
The resolution took a long time, but once we finally came to the conclusion that a face-to-face meeting would help build this comfort, that really did it. I waiting for my phone to ring and I got a call from the buyer first. It went really well. And then as soon as I hung up, I got a phone call from the seller said that went extremely well.
It's not unusual for the buyer and seller to just think that these are not human beings on the other side of the phone. They don't have this relationship and they feel like they're just being antagonistic. They don't have the right goal in mind. And then all of a sudden they meet and they have this romance.
Yeah, the relationship that they built was a really good, lasting relationship. I think they still stay in touch. My seller even offered to annually go in and have a discussion with the clients on their renewal with the buyer and helped him through that process.
You still keep in touch with the seller?
I do. In fact, it was Christmas and sellers texting me, "Merry Christmas. Hope you have a great New Year." To my wife.
That's validating. So we called this the cleaner because I thought you were cleaning up a mess, but actually you were guiding it along the entire time, not knowing how it was going to finish, but it certainly ended up smoothly, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
Kent, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Glad you're still in the business of cleaning.
Yeah.